NFTs and Web3 is all the rage right now. To some, it's really just a giant collection of internet crazies promoting scams and all kinds of other crazy stuff. To others, it is a fundamental shift in the way that the internet and the world works. There's a lot to unpack about the technologies and the economics and the philosophy behind NFTs, Web3, and the blockchain and all these other things. However, I think that we should really take a moment to at least consider and take a look at and investigate the cybersecurity implications of NFTs, Web3, and the blockchain. Because believe it or not, they do pose a tasty solution for some cybersecurity challenges. However, like a lot of other issues, a lot of it comes down to technology, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But first, let's talk about what NFTs are. NFTs are non-fungible tokens. What does that mean? Non-fungible means it's completely unique. It is not copyable, not duplicable. It is 1000% unique, and it belongs to the owner. Think of a social security number. It's supposed to be unique and it is supposed to belong to you. A non-fungible token is kind of like that. However, unlike social security numbers, you can trade it. One example I've seen is it's kind of like currency. However, if you have a $5 bill and I have a $5 bill and we swap $5 bills, the value that we possess inherently doesn't change. We both still have $5. NFTs, however, have specific values unique totally to them. Some NFTs have traded for tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is bonkers. Absolutely crazy. However, again, we're kind of looking at the art, and that really has been the public-facing kind of image of what NFTs have been to most people on the internet. A lot of people have made a lot of money off of NFTs. A lot of people have also been totally scammed from NFTs. And a lot of people have pointed out that because of the inefficiency in computing, the computing power required to be able to record NFTs on the blockchain and compute a lot of the math that has to go behind this in the blockchain, a lot of pollution ends up occurring. That's not good. So needless to say, there's a lot of critics behind NFTs, Web3, and the blockchain. However, there are also advocates, and a lot of the advocates have argued that it offers a more decentralized system, not only for currency, but also for transaction history and ownership and what it means to own things. But this technology is built on blockchain, and basically just, a quick summary of what a blockchain is it is a distributed ledger of transactions that occur on the internet. So what does any of this have to do with cybersecurity? Because we've talked a lot about economics, we've talked a lot about computing and the underlying technology, and we can still dive into more of that in a future video, so comment down below if that's something that you would like more of. However, for cybersecurity purposes, what does any of this actually serve? That's actually a question that I've had for a while, and inspired by a lot of the right-click, copy, and save memes on the internet, I asked the question, hey, can NFTs truly been stolen? After all, if it's recorded on the blockchain and ownership is distributed, then it doesn't matter who actually claims ownership of an NFT. The true owner is recognized by everybody else that stores an element of the blockchain. It's a distributed announcement of ownership. So can anybody actually steal NFTs? What does that mean if the NFT isn't pixelated art, but instead it's sensitive documents like a deed to a house or a title for a car or any kind of sensitive paperwork that you would want to ensure remains under your ownership? This took me down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I ended up getting in contact with Travis IQ. He runs a YouTube channel that actually talks a lot about this stuff, and he was a perfect person to be able to talk to this about. So we're going to jump into my conversation with Travis. So for people that have not met you yet, do you mind just kind of running through your channel and just kind of the things that you're working on with Web3 and NFTs?
Yeah, awesome. So my name is Travis Wentworth. My Twitter's Travis IQ, and the channel is Intelligence Quest. It's basically just an all tech channel that kind of started off as cybersecurity and infosec. And I'm obviously still interested in that space. I do a lot of training in that space, and I enjoy infosec and cybersecurity a lot. And that had led me to my understanding of cybersecurity and cryptographic hashing and public key, private key had kind of led me down the rabbit hole of cryptocurrency. And then, as you kind of make that progression, Bitcoin, some of the alternate coins in terms of their use cases, and then finally, like what we're talking about here, which would be use cases in terms of like NFTs NFTs, which I think is a very unique and niche use case that is really abstract at this point. I think that there are some things that might be valuable, but I think a lot of it is really abstract at this point. I've been dabbling in that space for the better part of 2 years or so, and then decided to make some content about it starting up in the last couple of months, just because it's been a pretty interesting passion of mine, and not be able to talk about it in my public forums has been, I don't know, I didn't really think about it until I started making the content, and now I like really enjoy it, and it is something that's a pretty big passion of mine. Obviously, I have if you check out my Twitter, I have another project going on in Web3, which is a blockchain-based video game company where we're starting out with the release of character NFTs, and that's a collaborative project with a bunch of people on the project. It's called This World of Mine. If they go by Twom Game on Twitter, and it's a bunch of developers out of Europe, some artists and creative directors and storyline designers, and a bunch of people. Most of them based in Europe. 2 or 3 of us are based here in the States. So.
That's awesome. A lot going on. A lot of really cool projects going on. That sounds great. Using the theory and technology for sensitive documentation like titles and proof of ownership of physical goods and commodities and things like that. And the question I pose publicly, is can NFTs be stolen? And what is there an elevated security benefit to using an NFT to prove ownership of something as opposed to like a physical paper document?
So I've heard this go a couple of ways, and there's some arguments for and against. The one that I like the most, right, is the decentralized nature of the ledger and the ledger entries, right? And so to say, I'm going to tokenize these unique assets, for example, let's say real estate, or you could even do this with driver's licenses and IDs, right? These are all, we don't think of them as NFTs, but what they are is they're unique identifiers, right? Of you, of your property, of your things, right? And for example, they're doing this in Estonia, right? The Estonian people have their own, right, smart cards, and those are digital identifiers for them. They're just not stored on a blockchain. If they were, they would be NFTs, right? They would be non-fungible tokens that are stored on a decentralized ledger that identify these individuals. And then you could point those NFTs to their health records, to their financial records, to their credit score, right? And I think it's pretty far down the rabbit hole, but I do think that I think it's a little bit farther out than we have the capabilities for right now. But I do think in the end, it's a better mechanism for storing and accessing data, and a more, let's say, a more intuitive mechanism. So you can see it all stored publicly, for example. Now that's the blockchain, not necessarily the NFT part, but that's great, right? What the NFT does is obfuscate some of that data storage, right? It says, here's a unique identifier of you. When you have access to this, here's what I can also show you, I think.
Okay, so you're still able to kind of obfuscate some of the more private factors of having that unique identifier. So like you mentioned, like public health records. The thing that kind of makes me curious, and I don't want to say concerned, but I'm not aware of like kind of how that works out with like health records and having your public identifier distributed on the blockchain. I can see how that provides a level of like non-repudiation. So like, like everybody knows that this is my unique identifier, but then tying like health records, would those be stored on the blockchain? Like what's the privacy risk there?
That's a great question. So I would say you probably wouldn't store those. We would call that on-chain, right? So I would say you wouldn't store that information on-chain for exactly the reason you're talking about. There is a mechanism to do it. It's called ZK rollup, zero knowledge proofs. And you might be familiar with this with like manipulating encrypted data. Basically, there are mechanisms to manipulate encrypted data and leave it obfuscated, right? So that you don't have to look at it to do something with it, right? It's difficult and computationally intense, but you could do it. That being said, let's kind of leave that like out, the zero knowledge proof stuff, because it's really, I think, really computationally intense, very difficult mathematically. And I don't honestly think that it's being implemented very effectively right now. There's a bunch of like ZK, it's called like ZK stuff. And people are talking about it really heavily in the space right now, especially in the crypto and blockchain space. And I think I don't think it's not mature enough to really warrant a discussion here. So I would say the answer is no, we wouldn't keep it on chain, right? And we would use your NFT or your digital identifier, right, to then reference centralized servers of your stuff. And the benefit, in my opinion, for using a digital token, non-fungible token, a digital ID like that is, we're going to use the digital ID anyways. Let's store it in a clear, right, decentralized open ledger that everyone can see, that just is an identifier of you and allow you to identify yourself with your private key. And we already know that like password protection is like a really weak mechanism for IAM, right, identity and access management. And I think, right, that public key, private key is going to be the mechanism. And I think that this might be a really great implementation of, using your private key to identify you in all aspects of your life.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So I guess this kind of circles back to the original question that I posed on Twitter. Like, can NFTs be stolen? And I guess a second parter to that would be like, how could attackers target that personal identifier?
Yeah. So it's funny that you say that, because my first thought when you posed the question was right-click saving NFTs, right? And I initially thought that that's kind of where you were going with the question. It sounds like that wasn't necessarily exactly where you were going with it, but I liked. So first of all, I'm glad that that's not where you're going with it, because I was like, this is absurd.
No, like I feel like that's kind of like become the meme, right? It's like everyone's kind of like, oh, I stole your NFTs. John Hammond has a fantastic video of talking about NFTs and just kind of like it's very high level, but it's like kind of like what you said on Twitter. It's really just creating a copy, but the original ownership hasn't changed hands.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so sorry.
I'm glad you get that. I'm glad you get that, man, because it's like taking a picture of a Michael Jordan rookie card and being like, and so now whether you think it's scammy and all this other stuff with those types of things, and I agree that it is, and you could draw parallels to other like they call it Cambrian explosions of technology. But if you go back to the internet was scammy as all get out in 1999, 2000, the booms. So I think that if you draw the analogs, you would actually start thinking about how this technology really is a Cambrian explosion of tech, and there's a bunch of cool stuff and there's a bunch of awful stuff coming out of it. So back to stealing of NFTs, the problem I think, is not you and I in terms of getting your private keys stolen and understanding the tech. I think it's really understanding, how the public understands this, because it's such a popular topic that people are trying to jump in without a fundamental understanding of what they're actually doing, right? And so the problem is really securing private keys. Right. That's the most important thing, because your NFT is associated with that private or that public key, which is then you can then validate those transactions and sign them and move them with your private key. And so I would say really the question is mostly around private key security. And so that is education and maybe some software mechanisms to prevent people from doing this. Right. And making sure people aren't, exposing their seed phrase and doing these types of things. The second one, which I think is a little bit more interesting, is understanding whether this NFT is in a centralized repository somewhere or whether it's actually associated with your public key, right? And so people don't understand the difference sometimes between some of these like NFT marketplaces, for example, because NFT art is kind of the meme, right? There are certain marketplaces that will hold your NFT as it's being sold, and now it's not in your possession, and then they get them stolen, and you go, well, how did someone steal my NFT if I didn't sign the transaction or interact with the smart contract? And the answer is you didn't actually have it in the first place. And so you need to understand the tech from that perspective, as opposed to an exchange that all they do is reference your NFT, allow people to bid on it, and then interact with the smart contract to remove it from your wallet and then send it to another wallet, which would be a completely different software mechanism. And so I think that we have to build software mechanisms that allow for you to have your private ownership of these both fungible tokens and non-fungible tokens, right? Because that's one of the primary benefits of this stuff, right? Is you get to self-custody all of your stuff. And that's a real benefit to people who are, concerned with that type of stuff. And then the second is we need to be clear with people about what the technology stack looks like, whether they are actually in possession of their non-fungible token or not. And that's whether it's digital art or collectibles or whatever, or whether it's, a unique identifier of you for health records, for your driver's license, for the property that you own, right? All these things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the other kind of like security concerns that I had with, I guess, maintaining control of NFTs and also like the personal identifier is whether or not it's recorded on chain or off chain. Because if it's on chain, then there's like and correct me if I'm wrong, if it's on chain, then you have that non-repudiation factor, or ownership is distributed. So even if someone attempted to steal something, it wouldn't like you just scrap the ledger like everybody else has.
I would call it immutability, right?
Right, immutability. Yeah, that's the word, right? But if it's off chain, then it's nobody has that. So anybody could come up with kind of quote unquote ownership of the NFT, and if they have the NFT and you don't, then they've effectively stolen it. Is this correct?
So I would say that if it's off chain, then it's really not an NFT, right? So I would say the problem, and you might be referencing one other thing, which is if you're referencing data off chain, right? So if you're saying the NFT is then referencing your data, which is then stored off chain, right? And that is a problem. And there's a lot of debate around when you're building systems, how do you store data associated with that NFT while maintaining the immutability and the security of the blockchain, but then having some mechanism for varying the data set, right? That doesn't have to do with interacting with the blockchain. I'll give you an example, which is the video game development. And so there are games that are storing all of their data on chain. It's called their metadata, right? With what the character is, what their traits are, how they interact with other characters, what biomes they're good in, all these things that are interesting about video games. You can store all that on chain, but what ends up happening is the game gets bogged down by chain interactions. And so you don't have the time, it becomes turn-based and clunky. And that's where a lot of people say, oh, this gaming boom in blockchain, for example, is really crap. You look at some of these games that are storing all this stuff on chain and they're very clunky. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to be, they came from the blockchain world and said, I want to make a blockchain game where I interact with everything on chain. Now the benefit is it's all immutable and all these character traits are stored and never change. So you know that character isn't going to get removed or manipulated or anything, which is really cool, especially if you're collecting characters, for example. Now the drawback is what you probably want to do is a hybrid model. And I think that as we evolve these things, what you're going to do is you're going to see some information stored on chain and some information stored off a chain. And the video game example is the one I know best because we're in development doing this stuff. But is you take some metadata associated with the character, you take some 3D information associated with how the character is rendered in the real world, you then render it and then allow you to play in the space. And then when you leave the space, right, we then, make some reference to your character no longer being there. And I think that that's probably a more, it's a much more smooth interaction. It's going to allow you to do a lot more with the infrastructure. And I think that mechanism is going to play itself out in other areas. It's just the video game space is something that I'm a little bit more familiar with because we're looking at it specifically.
No, that makes complete sense. And I mean, computing in raw computing power is so far in the conversation been kind of that main bottleneck, it seems like. Would the emergence and I guess really further development and deployment of quantum computing be able to help, or would that kind of emerge the next bottleneck is data transfer?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it enough to give you a great answer. The only thing I've thought about is like the security component. And not necessarily the data throughput. And from a security perspective, I think that you and I both understand that as the computational power increases, both the risk to computational cracking of codes and keys go up, but also the amount of algorithmic implementation you can put is much higher. The implementation is much better, right? You can do more complex mathematics and these types of things. So I didn't really address your question, but the only thing I've thought about is that like quantum computing is probably going to be both a boon for cryptography and a bane for cryptographic cracking. But in terms of data throughput and stuff, I think I agree with you that the throughputs are going to be probably the bottleneck until we roll out more robust high throughput infrastructures, both wireless and wired infrastructures. I tend to agree.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean that makes sense. And I mean I feel like a lot of this is mostly theoretical. Is that correct? Like we have like some proof of concepts in many cases using like NFTs for ownership of sensitive documentation, right? Is that being done anywhere?
I don't think so. I think there's one other thing that we didn't really talk about, which is a drawback that somebody pointed out to me one time is that this, especially physical ownership of stuff, let's think about like, tokenizing your real estate or tokenizing like something physical, there's another mechanism other than just ownership in a database that allows you to own physical stuff, right? And that's like the government securing that space for you to some extent, right? And so the idea that people want to like, remove themselves from this governmental oversight so that they can, exchange data and exchange ownership and these types of things in a decentralized way. Very useful, especially when you're talking about value transfer, like crypto or NFTs for, art or these other ephemeral things. We're talking about like physical assets. There's another layer to that, which is actually the physical security of the asset and physically securing the asset and asset transfer, right? That usually falls on the government, right? The government agrees that you own this. And if someone else tries to take it from you, then the courts get involved, right? And so I think that there's like a secondary layer that really needs to be like litigated, not just from a a law perspective, but also from like a cultural perspective as to how we want to deal with a decentralized ledger and value transfer, especially of physical assets, as it translates to the real world.
It sounds like in either case, there will have to be some form of centralization. Does that mean that there could really be at any point like a full rollout of the quote, like, Web 3.0, if the whole theory behind it is full decentralization, or will it really just have to be a blend between, a level of decentralization in some areas, like you said, and then, some level of litigation where at some point we just as a culture accept there will have to be some form of centralization in other places.
Yeah, I think that's the case, right? And I think that we all understand that we're centralized here in the real world to some extent, right? And so I completely agree with you. And I think that blend is going to be, kind of hashed out over the next 5 or 10 years. And I think that we've seen it though in the internet evolution as well, right? There were points in the internet where people refused to pay over this fake data transfer mechanism, right? Where people were afraid. I saw a clip just the other day where Jeff Bezos said people were mailing him floppy disks with money in them so that he could send them digital books or physical books, one or the other, right? And they were an online bookseller at that point. And so I think that we forget, because we're so embedded in this infrastructure, and not just you and I, but even like even the less tech ingrained people who are still using PayPal and Venmo and Cash App, right? That these things didn't exist 10 years ago, and they are an abstraction of physical cash. And we're just continuing that abstraction, but we're still going to be centralized in the real world to some extent. I hope personally that the decentralization is pretty thorough. Like, I hope that I can custody a lot of my own stuff, and that I just rely on the physical world to secure my home and my car, and the rest of it is on a ledger somewhere that I don't have to trust the government to validate. I don't have to trust some centralized state server to validate, because you and I both know, being in cybersecurity and infosec, that stuff just isn't secure, right? And that these decentralized mechanisms, in my opinion, are significantly more secure to store the data. They're just bottlenecked by what you can store on chain, centralization issues. When you start thinking about, if you want to store more data, then you have to centralize the nodes, some other things. But I think that we both agree that that's a more secure mechanism of storing the data if you can get the throughput issues and if you can sort out the decentralization issues associated with that much data.
That makes complete sense. I have like 2 questions that kind of come from that. One's like a very like abstract, high level philosophical question. Like, at what point do we just kind of reach like peak abstraction of things? Like, as we continue to abstract on the internet and decentralize, does that just continue indefinitely? Or is there kind of like a cap at which point it just kind of stops, abstracting itself?
There's got to be a cap, right? I'll give you another example that I thought was interesting, and I've seen some discussions around this, and I'm not sure how much I completely agree with it. It's the idea that you can abstract the price of energy. So people were saying, I can put Bitcoin miners out in the Yukon, right? And I can turn that energy into dollars where I couldn't before, because the transmission of the energy to the primary grid is going to be too difficult in these sets of things. I tend to agree, right? Which is pretty cool. And you can start pricing that energy, and then you can start contributing it to the Bitcoin network. But at some point, right, there's a maximum throughput, and that the Bitcoin network is going to misprice it, because it's not going to be able to operate, because the energy is going to not be available, because you're trying to pipe it into Bitcoin instead of into other things, right? And also, you can't just abstract the cost out in the middle of nowhere anyways all the time, right? You still have to have energy on the grid, and there's still some cost associated with getting the energy to the grid. And now people would probably debate me on that who've thought about it a little bit more thoroughly, but I think that's an example of, right, you can't just abstract the cost of energy to the nth degree, right? You still have to get it on the grid and get it to people so you and I can have a Zoom conversation and have the lights on, right? And so I completely agree with you. I don't have any idea of where this ends, right? We were just watching the new Matrix, and it's like, where is this all going, right? And I don't know, but I do agree that philosophically, and I mean, from an implementation perspective, there is some degree of centralization. And I don't think that, the Bitcoin maxis or the NFT maxis, I don't think they have it right in the general sense that we're just going to decentralize everything. You're going to live in the metaverse, and you and I are going to, hug it out and dap it up, in some concert in the metaverse instead of being in the real world to some extent, right? And that's a really extreme example, but we agree that there's got to be some mechanism to centralize this in the real world to some extent. Hopefully, in my opinion, that's not just like straight governmental centralization. It's more like we all agree that there's some level of centralization with both private entities, public entities, and the public in general.
No, yeah, that makes sense. And it's kind of like ultimately there's like this still like underlying market and physics truths. Like, you can't violate the laws of physics. And like the market will kind of always dictate a lot of things. What as far like you said, you can't really abstract the price of energy. It will be its price, right? Or you can't abstract to a point, right? To the nth degree for the end user, your average end user, and talking about securing not only the private key but securing some of their digital assets that are stored off chain. Do a lot, I'm not terribly familiar with a lot of like the sites and vendors that they can go to get involved, but like what are the security practices that you've been able to see at this point from those vendors and sites? Does it allow them a great level of security controls that they can, like we talk about like passwords and multi-factor authentication, or using like a private key to be able to authenticate into things. How secure is that? Can the end user really, if someone brand new is wanting to get involved with blockchain and NFTs, can they trust the security of some of these sites and vendors?
I love this question. So I'm going to break it down into two for you. So one is, can you trust the security? And two, where, how much has been implemented and where's it going, right? Because I think that we're in an infrastructure right now where we're building it out, right? I liken it to like the 1990s, 2000s internet. And so, there were, when you talk about the end user using the internet in 99, 2000, it looks very different from the end user using the internet now, right? And I think that we're gonna draw some of those analogs in terms of end user use and software build out and infrastructure and security. So that's one interesting take, right? Is that we're building this stuff out. It's really cool. We're in like the DNS era of blockchain, crypto, and NFTs, right? And you saw that they had a DNS analog, right, called Ethereum name service that literally just dropped a token. And they're doing DNS analogs for cryptographic for public key storage. Anyway, so in terms of security, right? So I did a post on my YouTube channel about this for Bitcoin specifically, right? Because I think that's one that Bitcoin as a decentralized mechanism is the alpha and the omega, right? And anybody who's in the space, I think, should participate in the Bitcoin infrastructure and the ecosystem, period, right? So I probably should have said that earlier, but so I talked about security, and there's really, right, three mechanisms, at least the way I see it right now, in terms of self-custodying. So I like the idea of you get to own this stuff, right? And so the first one is hot wallets, right? And these are cryptographic wallets, right, that hold your private key that are connected to the internet, right? That's literally like having your wallet on you. And I think that and so back to your end user point, I'm not sure that every end user understands this very well, but that is the least secure mechanism for storing both fungible and non-fungible tokens. And most of these hot wallets will store non-fungible and fungible tokens. Either one, the private keys will store them. It's whether the hot wallet will display it to you and have an easy mechanism for you to understand and move it around, right? Those hot wallets are similar to having your physical wallet on you. You probably don't want to keep a whole bunch of value in them. And realistically, they are less secure, right? They're a software abstraction. And so if there's anything wrong with that software library, log4j, for example, right, that nobody knew about at the base layer, you're gonna have a real problem. And also, right, they're interacting with the internet on a regular basis. They're usually browser-based. And so we understand that there's a number of mechanisms to manipulate this type of software. And so if there is, then specifically if that software is applied to cryptocurrency storage, then there are mechanisms to manipulate that. And so they're less secure. The second most secure mechanism of storage would be a hardware wallet. I usually have one sitting on the counter here. I don't have one right on my desk, but they are literally hardware storage. Basically, for the cryptographic for the cybersecurity folks, they're basically like HSMs, hardware storage modules, right? I wish they had called them that to start with, but they're hardware wallets that store your private keys, right? And they exist offline, and they have, in my opinion, minimalist software, right, to interact with that hardware, to give you just a base layer functionality and some mechanisms for viewing the contents of that private key as well, right? That's what the software does. It literally tells you what's associated with that private key based upon the ledger. And then the third, and maybe one you might not be as familiar with, is multi-sig. It's called multi-signature, and that allows you to have multiple keys associated with a single private key, which allows you to have like custodying. So you could have a trusted third party, let's say a bank, for example, although the idea is to get rid of banks, so it's kind of weird, but you could have some sort of trusted third party, right, that would hold, let's say, one key. You would hold one key, and then you'd hold one key in software, you'd hold one key on a hardware wallet, and you'd put it in a box somewhere, right? And so if you were to lose your software key, right, then you would still have two of three that would validate you, right? And you could still access the contents of those. It's also good for things like um, when you're doing like estates, right? When you're doing like estate planning, I know that people who have a significant amount of their net worth and a large net worth associated with cryptocurrency, right, then use these multi-signature tools for estate planning. So they leave one with an estate planner, they'll leave one with a centralized entity. So if they were to just get hit by a bus on Sunday afternoon, right, they would still have a mechanism for their family and their estate to access all of this value, right? Because we agree that whatever your opinion, there's a ton of value being stored in this ecosystem. So that's the security component. Whether the end user, I think your original question was really whether the end user has a fundamental understanding or how easy it is for the end user. I would say it's very technically prohibitive for the end user to do multi-sig. Hardware wallets aren't great. And even the software wallets, the hot wallets aren't ideal in terms of their implementation. I think that this is one of the benefits of being in a space that's evolving. And it's one of the things that has really drawn me to the space personally, is I just love how quickly the evolution of the space is taking hold, and seeing people evolve and make new things and then iterate quickly. It's just a really cool space to be in my opinion, for that reason.
Yeah, and I feel like multi-sig, that's such an interesting concept, and makes me think of like whenever my wife and I bought a car, right? We went to the bank to have that transaction notarized. Could multi-sig be a way, like you said, and this kind of goes back to the earlier question on there kind of ironically being some level of centralization, like having a third party verifying a transaction. Does that ultimately bring back a level of centralization to transactions? And can that be used by like, say, a government to implement tax in like some kind of an online transaction?
That's really interesting. I've never thought about it, and I completely agree. Right, that's certainly possible. By the way, we kind of already do this with certificate authorities, right? Your CAs sign these certificates. They're a centralized third party, and they use their private key to sign and validate the certs, right? They just don't do it on a decentralized ledger. But and so that mechanism, right, leads me to think that yes, I haven't seen any implementations of multi-sig used for like validation of transactions, for example, or for like alternate validation mechanisms other than just like single key storage. I'm sure that somebody's coming up with those solutions, and the space is just evolving so rapidly that I'm sure something like that exists, but I haven't seen it. But I agree with you, and I hadn't thought about it until this moment. I think it's a really cool mechanism.
Interesting. Well, hey, I mean, once this video goes live, if that's not like a thing that exists by then hey, let's get some credit for both of us,
Absolutely.
Some intellectual property theft by probably a small European government that's very forward thinking and fast acting.
You ever see those guys on Twitter? They're like, "We're early." That's us, man. We are early.
How about it? Well, I mean, I literally came into this with just like one question. Well, I had three. The first was, can NFTs be stolen? The second two the other two got answered kind of over the course of the conversation. And we just kind of like, I feel like enumerated so many concepts and things to talk about in this space. And I feel like we're really just scratching the surface and not even like diving deep into too much. So it's exciting. I really appreciate, you answering all my questions. I still feel like I need to spend a decent amount of time in the Google machine doing a ton of research, to be able to, I guess, understand a lot of things more,
Yeah. And I mean, the problem is it's evolving so quickly that sometimes, you're doing some research and you're wondering if this is gonna work or isn't. And then the next thing you know, somebody comes out with a solution and you're like, oh wow, I didn't even think about something like that. So that happened to me just the other day. I was in a Twitter space and they were announcing a solution to the Solana blockchain data storage problem. And I was like, wow, I did not think that was going to come around so quickly. I completely agree with you, man. And hopefully we've enlightened some people if they take a look at it. And if we have some additional questions, maybe we'll dive deeper into something more specific another time.
Yeah, that was a lot of information, And there's, again, so much to unpack from that. So again, like I said earlier at the start, if you are interested in more of this kind of content, let me know down in the comments about what kind of questions you have, and I'll put a video together just for you. Needless to say, we do live in an exciting future, but it is also one rife with discovery, and the evolution of technology will only continue to demonstrate itself. And right now it looks like Web3, NFTs, and blockchain and crypto are all manifestations of that digital evolution. Just like we talked about in the interview, we are at the very early stages of all this technology and what it really means for the internet. Will we go to a fully decentralized internet? Or will we kind of land somewhere in the middle? Who knows? I mean, we'll definitely see. We could end up just in a giant nuclear exchange. But anyway, if this video was helpful or informative to you, like this video, and also be sure to check out this video if you were confused on what that is. And if you're interested in other cybersecurity topics, check out the playlist down below. With that, I'll see you all next time. Bye.